In the DC universe, the concept of divine power is complex and multifaceted, with various characters wielding godly abilities, starting with the Spectre, who became the embodiment of God's wrath in More Fun Comics number 52. From the Spectre to Captain Marvel, who gained his powers from the wizard Shazam. Inspired by ancient gods and mythological figures, the DC universe is filled with heroes who have tapped into divine power. As we explore the 10 DC heroes who have successfully wielded the power of the gods, we'll examine the origins and mechanisms of their divine connections, starting with Wonder Woman, created by William Moulton Marston, who was inspired by the feminist and suffragist movements, as well as Greek mythology. The introduction of the new gods by Jack Kirby in 1971 expanded the DC universe's cosmology, introducing new concepts of divine power, as seen with Orion, who wields the Astro Force, allowing him to tap into the power of the gods. Mr. Miracle, Scott Free, has used the power of the new gods to escape from Apocalypse and fight against the forces of Darkseid, showcasing the feats and mechanisms of divine power in action. The DC Comics event Crisis on Infinite Earths saw the Anti-Monitor, a being of immense power, attempt to destroy the multiverse, only to be stopped by the combined efforts of the DC heroes and the Spectre, highlighting the consequences of unchecked divine power. During the Death of Superman storyline, Superman became an avatar of the sun god Ra, granting him immense power, illustrating the concept of divine empowerment in a major DC storyline. The character of Dr. Fate has undergone several revisions, including a stint as a godlike being with immense magical power, demonstrating the contradictions and retcons that can occur in a character's history. The 52 event introduced the concept of the gods of the multiverse, a pantheon of deities that oversee the DC multiverse, expanding the scope of divine power in the DC universe. The Trinity series saw Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman becoming gods, with Superman becoming the god of strength, Batman the god of wisdom, and Wonder Woman the goddess of love, exploring the concept of mortal heroes becoming divine. The New 52 reboot introduced a reimagined version of the Greek gods, who were reimagined as powerful, complex characters, demonstrating the impact of editorial decisions on the DC Universe's mythology. The DC Rebirth event restored the pre-New 52 continuity, including the original versions of the DC heroes and their divine connections, highlighting the contradictions and retcons that can occur in a universe's history. The Doomsday Clock series featured Dr. Manhattan, who stated that the gods are not what they used to be, and that the universe is a much darker and more cynical place, highlighting the theme of divine decline and the complexities of the DC universe. The Heroes in Crisis event saw the introduction of the gods of the multiverse concept, which explored the idea of gods and mortals coexisting in the DC universe, demonstrating the ongoing evolution of divine power in the DC universe. The DC Comics series The Question explored the concept of a mortal becoming a god, as the protagonist, Renee Montoya, becomes the new Question and gains divine insight, highlighting the theme of mortal heroes becoming divine. The character of Swamp Thing has been associated with the concept of the Green, a divine force that connects all plant life, illustrating the connection between nature and divine power in the DC universe. The Animal Man series featured the character of Buddy Baker, who gains the power to communicate with animals and becomes a champion of the natural world, demonstrating the concept of divine empowerment through connection with nature. The Sandman series explored the concept of the Endless, a family of divine beings who personify various aspects of the universe, highlighting the complexities and nuances of divine power in the DC universe. The Hellblazer series featured the character of John Constantine, a magician who often finds himself at odds with divine forces, illustrating the contradictions and complexities of divine power in the DC universe. The DC Comics event Infinite Crisis saw the return of the multiverse, which was destroyed during the Crisis on Infinite Earths event, demonstrating the ongoing evolution of the DC universe's cosmology. The Final Crisis event featured the character of Darkseid, who becomes a god and gains immense power, highlighting the dangers and consequences of unchecked divine power. The Blackest Night event introduced the concept of the emotional spectrum, which explores the connection between emotions and divine power, demonstrating the complexities and nuances of divine power in the DC universe. The Brightest Day event saw the return of several DC heroes, including Superman, who was resurrected and regained his divine connection, highlighting the theme of resurrection and divine empowerment. The Justice League Origins storyline featured the DC heroes forming a team to stop the villainous Darkseid, who seeks to gain divine power, demonstrating the importance of teamwork and cooperation in the face of divine threats. The Trinity War event saw the introduction of the Trinity of Sin, a group of divine beings who are tasked with maintaining balance in the DC universe, highlighting the complexities and nuances of divine power in the DC universe. The Forever Evil event featured the villainous crime syndicate, who seek to gain divine power and destroy the DC universe, demonstrating the dangers and consequences of unchecked divine power. The Convergence event introduced the concept of the Multiversity, which explores the idea of multiple universes and divine connections, highlighting the ongoing evolution of the DC universe's cosmology. The DC Universe Rebirth event restored the pre-New 52 continuity, including the original versions of the DC heroes and their divine connections, demonstrating the importance of continuity and consistency in the DC universe. But what about the characters who have walked the line between mortality and divinity? Dr. Fate, created by Gardner Fox and Howard Sherman, has undergone several revisions, including a stint as a godlike being with immense magical power in Dr. Fate No. 1, 1987, demonstrating the contradictions and retcons that can occur in a character's history. And that leads to the part where mortals become gods, as seen in the DC Comics series The Question, 1987 to 1990, which explored the concept of a mortal becoming a god, as the protagonist, Renee Montoya, becomes the new Question and gains divine insight in The Question No. 1, 1987, highlighting the theme of mortal heroes becoming divine. This theme is also reflected in the character of Swamp Thing, who has been associated with the concept of the Green, a divine force that connects all plant life, in Swamp Thing No. 1, 1972, illustrating the connection between nature and divine power in the DC universe. This connection to nature is also explored in the Sandman series, 1989 to 1996, which featured the character of Dream, also known as Morpheus, and the Endless, a family of divine beings who personify various aspects of the universe, in the Sandman No. 1, 1989, highlighting the complexities and nuances of divine power in the DC universe. The Convergence event, 2015, saw the introduction of the Multiversity, a concept that explores the idea of multiple universes and divine connections, in Convergence No. 1, 2015, highlighting the ongoing evolution of the DC universe's cosmology. And that leads to the question, what does it mean to be a god in the DC universe? Is it a blessing or a curse? The character of Renee Montoya, the new Question, provides some insight as she navigates the complexities of divine power and mortality. The connection to nature, as seen in the character of Swamp Thing, provides another perspective on divine power, highlighting the intricate web of relationships between gods, mortals, and the natural world. The Sandman series offers a more nuanced exploration of divine power, introducing the concept of the Endless, a family of divine beings who personify various aspects of the universe, and raising questions about the nature of godhood and mortality. The Hellblazer series, with its focus on the magician John Constantine, provides a more cynical view of divine power, highlighting the dangers of unchecked power and the complexities of mortal relationships with the divine. The Infinite Crisis event marked a significant turning point in the DC Universe's cosmology, introducing the concept of the multiverse and raising questions about the nature of reality and the role of gods within it. The Final Crisis event, with its focus on the villainous Darkseid, provided a more dramatic exploration of divine power, highlighting the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of balance in the DC Universe. The Blackest Night event introduced the concept of the emotional spectrum, which explores the connection between emotions and divine power, raising questions about the nature of godhood and the role of emotions in shaping the DC universe. The Brightest Day event, with its focus on resurrection and divine empowerment, provided a more hopeful view of divine power, highlighting the possibilities of redemption and renewal in the DC universe. The Justice League Origins storyline marked a new beginning for the DC universe, introducing a new generation of heroes and raising questions about the role of gods and mortals in shaping the DC universe. The Trinity War event, with its focus on the Trinity of Sin, provided a more nuanced exploration of divine power, highlighting the complexities and nuances of divine relationships in the DC Universe. The Convergence event, which introduced the concept of the Multiversity, raised important questions about the nature of divine power in the DC Universe and how it relates to the multiverse as a whole. This concept, which explores the idea of multiple universes and divine connections, adds a new layer of complexity to the DC Universe's cosmology. The Multiversity concept, created by Grant Morrison, allows for a wide range of divine possibilities, from the divine monarchs of the Multiversity's core worlds to the divine avatars of the outer worlds. This concept highlights the boundless nature of divine power in the DC Universe. Len Wein and Bernie Wrightson has a unique connection to the natural world, which is often associated with divine power. This connection raises interesting questions about the relationship between nature and the divine in the DC Universe. The Animal Man series, written by Grant Morrison, explores the idea of divine empowerment through connection with nature, highlighting the complexities and nuances of this relationship. This series demonstrates how the natural world can be a source of divine power and insight. The characters Jamie Delano and Garth Ennis often finds himself at odds with divine forces, highlighting the contradictions and complexities of divine power in the DC Universe. Constantine's experiences raise important questions about the nature of divine power and its relationship to human morality. The Sandman series, written by Neil Gaiman, explores the concept of the endless, a family of divine beings who personify various aspects of the universe. This series provides a nuanced and complex exploration of divine power, highlighting its many facets and contradictions. The Doomsday Clock series, written by Jeff Johns, features Dr. Manhattan, who states that the gods are not what they used to be, and that the universe is a much darker and more cynical place. This statement raises important questions about the current state of divine power in the DC Universe and its relationship to the modern world. The DC Universe Rebirth event, which restored the pre-New 52 continuity, highlights the importance of continuity and consistency in the DC Universe, particularly with divine power. This event demonstrates how the DC Universe's complex history and cosmology are intertwined with its concept of divine power. The character of Renee Montoya, who becomes the new Question, gains divine insight and raises important questions about the theme of mortal heroes becoming divine. This character's story highlights the complexities and nuances of divine power and its relationship to human morality. The Heroes in Crisis event, which explores the concept of gods and mortals coexisting in the DC Universe, provides a nuanced exploration of divine power and its consequences. This event raises important questions about the responsibilities and challenges that come with divine power. The Blackest Night event, which introduced the concept of the emotional spectrum, explores the connection between emotions and divine power. This concept highlights the complex and multifaceted nature of divine power in the DC Universe. The Brightest Day event, with its focus on resurrection and divine empowerment, demonstrates the hopeful and redemptive aspects of divine power in the DC Universe. This event provides a nuanced exploration of the possibilities and consequences of divine power. As we conclude our exploration of the 10 DC heroes who have successfully wielded the power of the gods, we see that the concept of divine power in the DC Universe is complex and multifaceted, with various characters and storylines exploring the idea of mortals becoming gods, the consequences of unchecked divine power, and the ongoing evolution of the DC Universe's cosmology. The DC reminder that, even in a world of gods and mortals, the heroes who wield this power are not invincible, and that their actions have consequences that shape the universe and its inhabitants. Thanks for joining us on this journey through divine power in the DC Universe. If you liked this video, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more in-depth analysis and discussion on the DC Universe and its many complexities.